The only sound in that bedroom was the wind pushing against the window. I sat on the edge of the bed with my hands folded in my lap because I did not know what else to do with them. My prayer cap was still pinned to my head. My wedding dress, the deep blue one I had sewn myself over 3 months of evenings, was still on my body. And across the small room, sitting on a wooden chair he had carried up the stairs himself, was a man I had married that very afternoon. A man whose voice I had never once heard. We had stood before the bishop for hours. We had eaten at the same table. We had been declared husband and wife before 300 people, and he had not said a single word to me. Not one. Before I tell you what his first word was, and why I have carried it with me for the rest of my life, let me introduce myself. My name is Anna. I grew up Old Order Amish in a small district in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and I share the stories the women of my world were never permitted to say out loud. If you want to hear the truth about Amish life from someone who actually lived inside it, not the version you get from a tourist buggy ride, subscribe and tap the like button. And in the comments, tell me this. Could you marry someone you had never spoken a word to? I want to read every answer. Now, I know how that sounds to ears outside my world, a bride and groom who had never spoken. But you need to understand how courtship worked in my district, because it was not like the looser communities you may have heard about. In some Amish settlements, young people attend singings. They take buggy rides home together. They court for a season before marrying. Mine was stricter than that. Far stricter. In my district, a marriage could be arranged through the families and through the deacon, and a woman was not always asked what she wanted. She was told who had spoken for her. Once a man had spoken for you, and once your father had given his blessing. The matter was largely settled. You might meet your husband once or twice, always with parents present, always in a silence broken only by the older people talking around you, never to you. Speaking directly was considered forward. Prideful? A modest woman kept her eyes down and let the arrangement carry her forward the way a current carries a fallen leaf. Not fighting it, not steering it, just going where it went. I was 26 when I married. In my world, that made me old. Most girls I had grown up with were married by 20, some by 18. By 26 I had quietly become what we called an old maid, a maidel. The woman who stays home and helps her mother, who folds the laundry of her married sisters, who pretends not to notice how the room goes soft and pitying whenever her name comes up in conversation. I had begun to believe no man would ever speak for me. I had begun to make peace with a life of being useful to everyone and chosen by no one. And then, one autumn evening, my father came in from the barn, hung his hat on the peg by the door, and told me that Amos Stoltzfus had spoken to the deacon about me. That was how I learned I was to be married, not from Amos. From my father with mud still on his boots. I had seen Amos perhaps 4 times in my life. He was a widower. His first wife had died 2 winters before, leaving him a small farm, no children, and a silence about him that the whole district had noticed. People said he had stopped speaking after she passed. Not entirely, he spoke to his horses, they said, and answered the deacon when asked things directly, but the easy talk of a man among neighbors had gone out of him the way heat goes out of a stove overnight. Some said it was grief. Some said he had always been that way, and the grief only deepened it, and now this quiet, hollowed-out man had spoken my name to the deacon, and I was to spend the rest of my life beside him without ever having heard him say so much as good morning. I want to be honest with you about what I felt, because I think the truth matters more than making myself sound brave. I was afraid. Not of him exactly, of the not knowing. There is a particular fear that comes from binding your whole life to a person who is a closed door. I did not know if he was kind. I did not know if he was cruel. I did not know if the silence in him was sorrow or coldness, and those are 2 very different things to lie down beside every night for the rest of your years. When I tried to ask my mother about it, she only told me that a good wife learns her husband the way she learns the weather, by living under it. That was the whole of my preparation. Live under it, learn it the way you learn the sky. The wedding was held on a Thursday in late November, after the harvest was in, the way our weddings always were. I woke at 4 that morning to help with the cooking, though it was my own wedding, because that is simply what was expected of me. There is no bride in my world who lies abed on her wedding morning. By noon the house and the barn were full, 300 people, maybe more, seated on long wooden benches, the men on one side, the women on the other. The ceremony ran nearly 4 hours. The bishop preached on the duties of marriage, on a wife yielding to her husband, on a husband loving his wife as he loves the church, on building a household that honors God through obedience, labor, and the bearing of children. Through all of it, Amos sat beside me without looking at me, and I sat beside him without looking at him, 2 strangers being sewn together by words spoken over our heads. After the ceremony came the meal: roast chicken, bread filling, mashed potatoes under gravy thick enough to stand a spoon in, and choufle pie, and coffee that filled the whole house with its smell until the windows fogged. The guests stayed for hours. There was singing the slow old hymns from the Osbund, no instruments, the notes seeming to come from somewhere very deep and very far away. I smiled until my face ached. I served and cleared and accepted the quiet congratulations of the women. My husband sat among the men the entire time and said almost nothing. I felt the eyes of the district on me, on the old maid finally chosen by the widower who never spoke. What a pair, I imagined them thinking. The leftover woman and the broken man. Then, as the lamps were trimmed low and the last buggies pulled out into the cold, we went upstairs. The room was plain, the way every room in my world was plain. A wooden bed, a quilt my grandmother had pieced, a washstand with a basin of cold water, a single chair, no mirror, no lock on the door. I could hear my younger cousin still washing dishes below, the clatter of plates, a tired laugh, the scrape of a bench being dragged across the floor. I sat on the edge of that bed in my wedding dress with my hands folded, and Amish came in and closed the door behind him and sat down on the chair across from me. The silence in that room was so large I felt I could barely breathe inside it. He did not come toward me. He did not reach for me. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his big rough hands hanging down between them, looking at the floor. The wind pushed at the window, the lamp flickered, and I sat there in my finished dress, feeling the whole weight of my life settle onto me, this life I had been handed without being asked. This man who was now mine, and yet felt further from me than the strangers who passed our farm on the road. I don't know how long we sat like that. Long enough that my legs grew stiff. Long enough that the noise below faded and the house went quiet, until there was nothing left in the whole world but the two of us, the dark and the wind. I had begun to think he might never speak at all. I had begun to prepare myself for a marriage made entirely of silence, the way you prepare for a long winter by going hard and small inside yourself. And then he lifted his head. In the dim lamplight I saw that this man, this silent widower the whole district pitied and whispered about, had tears standing in his eyes. He opened his mouth, and the first word my husband ever spoke to me, the first word in all the hours of our wedding day, came out so low I almost didn't catch it. He said, "Sorry?" That was all, just that one word, sorry. I didn't understand it at first. Sorry for what? Sorry that he had married me? Sorry that I was the one he'd chosen? My heart dropped through the floor. But then he kept going, slowly, the way a man speaks when the words have been frozen in him for years and are only now breaking loose. He said he was sorry that I had to be given to a man like him. He said he knew the district called him broken. He said he knew I was a kind woman who deserved a husband who could talk and laugh and make a home feel warm, and that he didn't know if he could ever be that man again. But he told me he had watched me at the worship gatherings for 2 years, watched the gentle way I tended the old women and the small children, and that I was the only person in the world he had felt he could bear to speak to again. He said he had stayed silent all day because he was afraid that if he opened his mouth, he would weep in front of 300 people, and a man weeping at his own wedding would shame us both. So he had said nothing. He had carried the silence all the way up the stairs, and now, alone with me, he had finally let it go, and the first thing that came out was an apology. I want to tell you what that did to me. Sitting there in my wedding dress because everything I had been afraid of turned over in a single moment. I had been afraid of his coldness, but this was not coldness. This was a grief so deep it had no words, and the first word it found, when it finally found one, was sorry. He was not a closed door. He was a man who had locked himself away because the one time he had loved, it had been taken from him, and he did not know if he could survive loving again. And he was apologizing to me for not being whole. I reached across that small dark room and took one of his rough hands in both of mine, and found I was crying too. I told him the only thing I knew to be true, that I had no idea what I was doing either. I told him I was 26 and unchosen and afraid, and that I had spent the morning of my own wedding certain that no man would ever truly want me, only tolerate me. And I told him that a man who could say sorry, who could weep for a woman he hadn't yet learned to love, was not a broken man at all. He was a man with a heart still in him, buried, but beating. We did not rush anything that night. We sat on the edge of that bed and talked until the lamp burned down to nothing. We talked about his first wife, and I let him, because I understood I could not be his wife if I could not also hold his grief. We talked about my years of being the one left behind. We talked those first strange hours, more honestly than many couples talk in 20 years of marriage. When we finally lay down under my grandmother's quilt, still in our wedding clothes, too uncertain and too tender for anything more, He held my hand in the dark, and I listened to his breathing slow, and I thought, this is not the marriage I was afraid of. This is something else. I don't have a name for it yet, but it is something else. The next morning I woke before dawn, put on my apron and went down to start the stove, because there were chores and there is always work, and no one in my world asks a new bride how her wedding night went. No one ever would. But Amos came down behind me and stood in the kitchen doorway in the gray light, and he said, "Good morning, Anna." 2 words this time. And after a wedding day of complete silence, those 2 ordinary words felt like the sun coming up. Our marriage was not a fairy tale. I won't pretend it was. There were years that were hard, years when his silences came back and settled over the house like fog, years when I had to remember what my mother had told me, to live under him the way you live under weather. But he kept talking to me a little more each year. He told me things in the dark he never told another living soul. And when our children came, 3 of them, I watched a man the whole district had given up on learn to laugh again. Slowly, like a creek thawing after a long freeze, I left the Amish world later in my life for reasons that are another story for another day, and the leaving cost me nearly everyone. But that is not the part I want to end on. In the years since, in the long work of understanding the life I was raised in, I have thought a great deal about how I was married. I was handed to a man without being asked. I was given no voice, no choice, no preparation, nothing but my mother telling me to live under him like weather. And I will say plainly, I do not believe any woman should be married off in silence to a man she has never spoken to. That a whole life can turn on, whether the stranger you're given happens to be kind, is not a system. It is a gamble dressed up as obedience. And yet the man I was gambled into turned out to carry, behind all that frightening silence, a heart more tender than any I have known. The system that bound us was wrong. But the word he gave me that night was right. Because in a world that taught us to endure, to yield, to swallow our feelings and call it faithfulness, a man sitting in the dark and choosing, as his very first word to me, the word sorry, that was the most honest thing anyone in my whole life had ever said. If you grew up in a world where your future was decided by people other than you, where you were handed a life and told to be grateful for it, I see you. If you ever bound yourself to someone before you knew them, and lay awake afraid of who they might turn out to be, I see you too. And if you're waiting even now for someone to simply say a true word to you in the dark, I hope it comes. I hope it's gentle. I hope it's sorry, or good morning, or I see you, whatever the true word turns out to be for you. Tell me in the comments what you would have done if you'd been sitting in that room. Tell me your own story if you're ready to share it. And if you want to keep hearing the truth from behind the prayer cap, subscribe to Hannah the Amish Girl. There is so much I haven't said yet. Until next time, remember that the quietest people are often carrying the deepest words. You only have to wait for the dark and listen.